One time, late June, early July, we cross, but at that point, they're coming from the direction of the sun. So their arrival to Earth is going to be very difficult to see because they're coming from the direction of the sun, right? But that's exactly where, on June 30th, a Taurid meteor would be coming from. And then also the fact that it's the perfect date for the peak of the shower and the correct place in the sky, to me, is pretty convincing evidence that it was most likely a remnant of that Taurid stream. The other time that the Earth crosses is late October, early November. In fact, we've just passed out of it within the last week, basically. But it peaks, interestingly, coincidentally, between like October 30th and November 4th or 5th. So it's peaking right around Halloween time. In fact, they've been called the Halloween meteors, and there's some very interesting...
Halloween fireworks, sometimes they call them.
The Halloween fireworks, yeah. But there's some very interesting work done by a researcher back around the early 20th century named Grant Halliburton, who spent about 15 years researching the connections between ancient calendars. And he concluded one thing very interesting was that a lot of these ancient calendars were being synchronized by people's observations of the rise and fall of the Pleiades, which is the shoulder of the bull. The Pleiades comprises basically part of that constellation of the bull.
Of Taurus, yeah.
Yeah, the shoulder of the bull. And what he came up with was that in his research, he discovered that many of these stories that were associated with this, like the slaying of the celestial bull, you know, Gilgamesh and Enkidu in the earliest known story, they fight this celestial bull. There's many counterparts and variants of that in mythical stories. And so what he then found out, though, was that in many cases, that our modern Halloween actually goes back thousands of years to an ancient Day of the Dead that was observed all over the earth at the same time every year, even in the southern hemisphere, and it usually revolved around a commemoration of the culmination of the Pleiades, which is when the Pleiades crosses the local meridian. In other words, it reaches the keystone of the royal arch, so to speak, up in the sky. So if you go out on Halloween now and you face the south in the northern hemisphere, you will see the Pleiades right at midnight. At midnight, they will be, if you think of the arch of the zodiac as being like a clock, it's right there at midnight, right? Well, here's the interesting link, is that in all of these myths, what Halliburton discovered over and over again was that the Day of the Dead ultimately went back to myths of the destruction of the world by a great flood and or fire.
It's fascinating that it's all coming out of the constellation Taurus, too, and it's the celestial bull that they're fighting in these ancient myths, and that all these cultures around the world are celebrating the Day of the Dead at this exact same time. This is amazing stuff.
And right now our science is closing its eyes to this. I think it's fair to say, with the Taurid meteor stream, which is a very big issue in this whole discussion, that we are dealing with a hidden hand in human history. It's something that is going to ultimately require us to re-explain almost everything. The skeptics hate it. They can't bear it because, first of all, it involves cataclysms. And secondly, it involves the possibility of losing a whole civilization from the record. It's really interesting when you look at the dates of this cluster, this episode of bombardment between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. That's the period that just immediately precedes what mainstream academia think of as the very beginnings of civilization. And they've just never, maybe it's not even their fault. This is so recent, this science is so new that they've not had time to adapt to it. But if they adapt to it and take this into account, then suddenly what was an extraordinary and absurd and impossible idea, that there was a lost civilization 12,000 years ago, becomes a